So let's get started because I'm so excited about my guest tonight. Those of you who know me will know that I love traveller stories and that I worked a lot with Duncan Williamson, who was a Scottish traveller. But I'm not a traveller myself. I know a certain window onto the Scottish traveller community. I'm interested in the whole society and different races and travellers in different countries. But I know very little about travellers in Ireland. And I know that some of you I've seen at Traveller Pride Week events over the last couple of weeks. And I've been introduced to lots more fantastic singers, storytellers, thinkers and activists, and one of those people is the amazing Oein DeBhairduin, who is my guest tonight. He's an author, he's an activist, he's a storyteller, he's a herbalist, and just really knowledgeable and with such a wealth of experience and traditions, and somebody who really is taking the tradition on in all sorts of new and interesting ways. So let me bring Owen up. So welcome Owen. So everybody, this is the bit where you can use that chat. You can whoop, you can clap, you can write whatever you like on the chat to make Owen feel welcome, and please do. So welcome Owen to taking the tradition on.
Thank you very much, and it's excited to be here.
Now, both of us, it is quite a windy night tonight, which seems to be having a bit of an effect on our internet connection. We are both cuddled up with our Wi-Fi boxes and plugged in. It's going to be a challenge for us tonight because both of us talk quite quickly when we get excited. So we're both having to try and slow down a bit. And I'm a bit husky as well. So if there's a blip in the internet, then do let us know, and I can always ask Owen to say things again. But Owen, you are an Irish traveller, and I suspect there is a lot of people here who don't really know what that means. So I'm going to invite everybody on the chat. When you think of an Irish traveller, what springs to mind? What do you know about that community? Do you know anything at all? They're all thinking very hard now. The two fingers typists are getting going. Can almost hear the sort of the click, click, click thinking. Only the stereotypes, Shane says. That's interesting. I mean, I'm quite interested to know what you think the stereotypes are, because one thing I have found in these conversations is that my stereotypes are not always the same as everybody else's. I think I've got the same view on life, and it turns I'm a bit left field. So horse fairs, caravans and horses in the past. So not necessarily now, I'm guessing Kathy's saying. Everybody's really nervous to stick their neck out and kind of, I don't want to just only know stereotypes about people. Tarmac. Right, so I'm not sure where you're going with that, Shane. Do you mean that you see Irish travellers working on the road and putting the tarmac down, or walking on the tarmac?
We would be associated with the restoration and putting in of tarmac in people's homes, especially within like the pan-European, like German kind of areas in Britain. Very, very rarely, if ever, in Ireland.
Peaky Blinders type of travellers.
Oh, I'll go looking for my hat.
So a little bit from sharing cups of tea with people. Oh, there we go. Simon's saying generous and clean. Yeah, I'd go that. So this is where this is our starting point, Owen. So you are in a room with people who are really interested, but not very knowledgeable. So will you tell us what you mean by an Irish traveller and who the Irish travellers are?
So first off, the term Irish traveller will be what we will be titled in English. But in our own language, which is Gammon Cant, we will be known as Care or Pavi, which means, or as Gaeilge in Irish would be Luke Stool, which means the walking people. People don't understand the word Pavi to be people who are traders, and then in Care comes both association with Tinker and Tanker, which means metal workers, but also Minarara, which is people who use their hands. Our word for hands is Min or Mala. So it was associated with people who are either crafters, traders, or people who had walked. I suppose kind of legally and community-wise, like travellers we are the indigenous nomadic ethnic people of Ireland, which is now thankfully moved on to a more of a legal recognition rather than just a social one. And one of I suppose the challenges we often always have within the community is that we are seen to be retrospective. We used to travel, we used to have horses, we used to have campfires, we used to, so it's all about who you used to be rather than who you are. So part of that would be, I suppose, reconnecting people. That in Ireland alone, there's 47,000 of us. We do suspect there's more. There's only 47,000 was recorded in our census, and many people didn't fill out the census or want to make ethnic declarations. But yeah, so I think that most would know is either by distance and by mass media, which it can be filled with stereotypes, or by retrospective understandings of they used to do this, or my grandparents or my mother, rather than within the contemporary current sphere of life. And I see that, I suppose, as something that can bring me worry, but also a wonderful invitation for us all to discover a indigenous population that is often overlooked, misunderstood, but so very filled with all these treasures that people should just let themselves enjoy and embrace and share.
That's such a great description. Now, a couple of people were struggling with the sound. I have turned that up. Can people hear it now, or was it just Shane? Is that now a reasonable level, and can you hear? Because I don't want people to miss what you're saying. Right, Heather can hear okay. It was just Shane's now turned you up. So Elaine, we are doing our best, and we're both trying to talk a bit more slowly. We've done everything we can to get the best signal, and I'm just going to have to keep getting Owen to slow down a little bit and to be as distinct as you can, because we're just struggling a little bit with the Wi-Fi tonight. Thank you, Elaine. Yeah, absolutely. It's so frustrating when you can't hear things that you really want to hear. And so you're saying about used to walk and used to do things with their hands. Certainly, everything that I've seen coming out and the things that are celebrated about Irish culture, it still seems to be things that you do with your hands, and I don't think this is associated with any of the names. It's about the oral tradition. It's things that you do with your mouth. It's sort of, oh no, have we lost Owen altogether? Disaster. Right, I think hopefully we will be getting Owen back in. He is not at home at the moment. He did introduce me to this palatial place that he is staying, and they're right by the beach. And last night they had, it was just saying it was glorious. The rain was coming in and hammering on the sea, but I think that the storm may be coming in again, and the rain coming in, and definitely the wind. So I'm hoping very much that Owen's going to he's going to be looking at that box and seeing. I don't know if folk herbalism works terribly well on internet. I think it is one of those things that sometimes people who are good at herbalism tend to knacker electronic things. So we shall see. Has anybody got any questions for me? I suppose the thing that we can do is, this is the first in the series, and I was wondering what to do for a third series and who to have, and if there should be a different theme. I felt I'd only just got started with storytellers and the lives they live and walk, the lands they live and walk. And there are so many amazing cultures out there that I'm hoping to just keep going, I think, with storytelling around the world, and we are what we tell. Right. Sarah is asking, what is Owen's new book? So this is one of the things that we are going to be talking about tonight. It's Why the Moon Travels. And the really important thing about this book is, as we'll talk about with Owen, is that it's the first book, really, that is certainly in Irish culture where the stories have been collected and written by an Irish traveller. And certainly that's sort of been the case with the travellers that I've met in Scotland as well, is it's academics going into cultures. And that's what's happened in England as well. We have the Grimm's brothers, and certainly around my area at Charlotte Burn. It's academics who go in, who record people and tell the stories of settled people, of collect travelling culture stories, write them down, maybe with a bit of editing on the way. So this is illustrated by a traveller, they're retold by a traveller, and they are probably travellers' tales. So, can I give a summary of what Taking the Tradition On is? And you don't know nothing about the series. So this Taking the Tradition On started because I had a project working with Duncan Williamson, who is a Scottish traveller, and I had lots and lots of his reel-to-reel tapes that I was digitising, having been apprenticed to him when 20 years ago in my late teens and early 20s. And I started to do podcasts with people talking about Duncan, why he was so important for the British storytelling scene, why traveller culture was so important, and sharing those stories and looking at storytellers and how they've been influenced by Duncan. Lockdown came. I wasn't sure I'd get good enough sound quality on a podcast. So I thought, well, if we've got the opportunity, why not have it as a video as well? And it's just been an amazing thing we hear the stories that storytellers tell. We often don't know very much about storytellers themselves, why they've been inspired to become storytellers, how those stories feed them, what it is that they want to achieve by going out into the world and telling stories. So that is the heart of this series. It's introducing storytellers and their stories behind what they do. And that's what this series is going to be. So we're starting off in Ireland with Oein DeBhairduin. Hopefully we'll be coming back soon. But we'll be going around the world. And you can suggest people to me. This period has been a marvellous time of reaching out and meeting new storytellers and getting to know people with traditions that I didn't know anything about before and learning more. And this space is a space where I can be open about my ignorance, admit the things that I don't know, and ask the questions that you don't normally get to ask, that would normally be quite polite to ask, and maybe a bit rude, because we've created this space that is an open space, that is based on the fact this is the chance where we get to ask those questions to show our genuine interest. Can I explain the difference between Scottish and Irish travellers? Well, it's a bit like the difference between Scottish and Irish people. So I think travellers generally are the people that were there first. Travellers would normally say they are the people who existed in a country. They're the indigenous people. So although Roma and travellers get lumped in together quite a lot, Roma are what set of people normally called gypsies, I suppose, who are called gypsies from Egyptians because it was thought that they'd come from Egypt, and they've travelled through lots of countries and ended up all over the place. While they have a similar lifestyle to travellers, travellers are the people who were first in the country, who had a nomadic lifestyle of following the seasons, following the food, following where they needed shelter and water, and maybe where the salmon were flowing, when the best times to get the shellfish were, where you get the mushrooms in a different place. And they've carried on that nomadic lifestyle, or certainly have tried to, and that's getting more and more difficult. And even though we tend to think that human rights are more important now, we give more weight to them, there's more legislation for them, in Ireland and in Britain as well, the government seem to be doing their best to make nomadic culture illegal, and it's getting harder and harder to be nomadic. And one of the things when I was talking to Owen before we started this, when we were talking about what we might talk about tonight, was he was saying, we were talking about Black Lives Matters and how travellers aren't really being involved in that because they're not people of colour. They're a different minority, they're a different culture, but they're not as obviously different, I suppose, but they're not included in that Black Lives Matter. They kind of never seem to be one thing or another. And what he said was, the thing is, people tend to turn around to you and go, yeah, but you can just stop being a traveller. Why don't you just move into a house, and that thing that you can just stop being who you are. Whereas, if you're black, you're black, and there's nothing you do that. Yeah, okay, you have to keep being black, but you're a traveller, just stop. And that's been a really pervasive attitude, and that thing that the assumption that the majority of you is right, and that why would you want to be a traveller? Why would you want to have that hard lifestyle? Was Duncan ever in Ireland in his travelling days, Amy? Well, I went to Dublin with Duncan once. We went over to Neil Hayes was running a festival in Dublin, and as part of that festival we went and visited some Irish travellers in their communities, and they were able to understand each other. So Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic are different. Irish cant and Scottish cant are different, but they have enough similarities that they were able to talk to each other and understand each other. So I don't know if Duncan went over to Ireland when he was still actually on the road. I don't think that he did, but he certainly went over in later days. Let's see what other questions there are here. The 2-volume A Traveller in Two Worlds, David Campbell and Duncan Williamson in conversation, is such a fascinating personal insight into the tradition and history. Absolutely right. It is a fantastic 2-volume thing, and I would also recommend The Thorn in the King's Foot as a companion to that, as kind of the first book that Linda did of Duncan's stories, and quite a lot of Linda's comments about meeting Duncan. And I think I missed a couple of questions earlier on. How do I know Owen, and what made me reach out to him in particular? I don't know Owen, actually. I only found Owen very, very recently through Traveller Pride Week, and I saw his book being advertised, Why the Moon Travels, which I just thought looked beautiful. And that's absolutely everything that I've done with Duncan and the Travellers and the School of Scottish Studies. The collectors and the tellers are two totally separate groups of people, and you do really tend to get kind of the white middle class academics going and recording the Travellers. So and I know that Tom McCarthy as well, who's a singer, is doing a very similar project. He's also an Irish traveller, of collecting the songs within the Irish travelling community, and then he's going to be putting, I'm not sure if he's going to be putting CDs out or if it's just going to be a database, but I think he's helping travellers to record their own CDs so that they can record their own work and sell it directly without having to go through a middle person, without having to go through the settled community and other people recording them. So what I wanted to do, I mean, this is the thing, is I've become really aware over lockdown of not just what social media bubble I'm in, but what a bubble I'm in generally. I know loads and loads and loads of storytellers, and I know the kind of traditional storytelling scene in Britain really well. But going into other art forms, going into areas of digital expertise, finding your way into those other communities and finding the right people to work with, I found really, really difficult. And I don't want to be just talking to the same old people all the time. I think one of the things that lockdown has really given us is, now we've got Zoom and now we're all a bit better at being able to talk internationally, is reaching out to people that I didn't know, and trying to bring new people into the storytelling scene and trying to build bridges between one space and another. I know very, very little about Irish traveller culture. Owen just seemed a really, really good place to start, and I just messaged him and said, can we talk? And so we've had a couple of really fantastic and really fascinating conversations. Owen is quite unusual in the way that he has really kind of specifically decided to be a voice for his people. So he's been working in the Senate office of one of the senators in Oireachtas, and this was one of the other things that I feel really bad about being ignorant about, is how little I know about the Irish governmental system. It's just across the Irish Channel. It is so close to Britain. People in Ireland know quite a lot about what's going on in Britain. I really know very little about governmental systems in different European countries, and that again is something that I think I need to change. And I think that Owen was saying that kind of the way that travellers are treated in Ireland is quite similar to England, and their current government has quite similar views on really locking down on how people travel. And I think that Irish travellers during lockdown have had a really tough time, the same way that English and Scottish travellers have had a really tough time as well. Let's see what else is on here. Oh, look, how exciting. Owen is back. Hopefully we are going to be able to talk to him and hear him.
I'm back, I hope.
Hooray!
Yeah.
Hooray! People have been so patient.
I very much appreciate there are 35 people here. Listen, well done. I'm impressed.
Everybody.
I was sending you messages of shots of the internet down. They're going, how's she getting them? There's no internet.
Well, I've just been going, well, Owen said this, and when I was talking to Owen, he said that. So we've just been talking about you.
It's all lies. It's all lies.
So one of the things that we started talking about when you weren't here, and actually we had loads of questions, I was going to read, because there's a bit in the introduction that I was going to read to introduce you, and I was going to do that, but you're back in time. So I don't want to talk anymore. I just want to make the most of you being here. I'll do that if we lose you again. Tell us what inspired you to write this book, and if it was a big deal for you to actually put oral tales into a written context, and if that was quite a tricky thing to do.
Okay, so I grew up with a family of storytellers, and I didn't actually realize that being from a family of storytellers, especially for travellers, which is very ordinary, normal, everyday kind of experience, until I was 12 and I went to a storytelling festival, and there was all these people sitting down, and there was all the hushed voices, like the storyteller is going to tell a story, and I sat there kind of thinking, this is just like an evening, you know. I didn't realize that people had gravitated to all these tales and stories in such a wonderful way, in a way that I was just totally blessed with within my like useful context of, I had found that situation setting to be so ordinary, yet people were paying to come in to listen to stories. But I did quite realize quite quickly is that all the stories that there are some collections of stories about the Mincarry, the Irish traveller people, but they're not from us. They're usually from settled authors who've sat with us and listened to our stories and reproduced them. And so that's a little bit problematic, because depending on who we're telling the story to, we change the story. And when it came to writing the story down, stories, because I'm really fascinated actually with things like the Ulster cycle here in Ireland, where we have our legends like Cú Chulainn and Tanta and Queen Maeve, and people are very fixed on, he did this and then he did this and this is what happened next. And I find that, and most travelers find that, a very unnatural way of storytelling. Because stories are supposed to change and grow and adapt, and to bring your biases with you, to bring your passions with you, to bring your fears, your loves, brings your own experiences and the situation where you are, and that all becomes part of the colouring of a tale and the sharing of it. So when it came to writing it down, it was very difficult, because I wanted to honour as many of the versions I had heard of the tales as possible without leaving anything out. And there was parts I had forgotten that had found me later, and other parts that other people had I'd never heard of before after the book had come out. And I think that's actually one of the beautiful things about storytelling, is that it's something that's alive. Like, we can over academize it, we see there's a folklore and the ideas and the psychological archetypes. But then you listen to tales and you embrace them, and you see how they travel and move and grow. They're living entities. You know, and if we look at our lives, what are we but made of stories? We are made from stories and our experiences, and they are what form us, what hold us, what grounds us, what gives us our direction in life. And yeah, so it was a bit of a challenge, but also when you write something, a story becomes the story, and that's very problematic. Because suddenly that becomes the story of authority, or that's how the story should be told. And in one way, I felt I was settling stories. Like, here I was getting a nomadic people's stories, and I'm settling them into this paper, this little like a rectangular box. And when they're not meant to do that, they're actually meant to grow with us. And I've heard people reshare the stories, because a lot of the stories are from my lineage, my family's lineage, and there's some responsibilities when it comes to stories. One is that you always share where it comes from, and that honors the people who is behind. Is that no matter how fantastic it is, you share it as truthful, because it is truthful. It carries a truth with it. A truth may not be the truth, but it is still truthful. And you kind of, you make sure that it's for an entertainment as well as other possibilities of lesson making, of instruction. So it's the idea of, like, it should never be painful. And even when it came to writing the book, I'm fascinated by these wounded writers who like slave over pages. And I sat down, spoke into a dictaphone, listened back a couple of times, realized I have a terrible voice, got used to it, re-spoke it again, eventually put it down on paper, kind of wanted it to grow as it needed to grow. And but also interesting thing, I started out, I don't know if I actually told you this in our earlier chat, I started out not wanting to write stories about travel, because that's what travelers do. We're left to educate the wider population. Now, we spend most of our time saying, this is who we are and this is what we do. And I was like, oh, that's fine. I don't want to do that. I just want to share stories. But we're not the stories that wanted to be told. Every single time, stories that were coming up were stories of my own people. And I was like, oh, right, just give in, you know, give in to the moment. And I was quite blessed to find a wonderful publishing firm as well, called Scheme Press. And we went through a process of where we interviewed each other for suitability. And I think that's something that people don't share, that I wouldn't share things that are so sensitive and real to me in spaces or with people I thought wouldn't recognize them as being something that's been sacred. And so we went through a process of like, do they know travelers? Are they respectful travelers? Are they going to try to force a hyper commercial product, or are they wanting to share tales and stories and understandings and expressions? And thankfully, it was the latter. And yeah, and like I honestly, I thought I was making a small little paper bird that I was going to send up into the world, and she came home and she roosted in far more ways than I ever thought. And I'm enjoying learning new tales and stories and understandings I would never have come across if it wasn't for the work. But also so many of our own rising generation of people who are writers or storytellers, because I'm really fascinated with the difference between an author and a writer, and a writer and a storyteller. Like, everybody's a storyteller. Suddenly you have a different space and sphere when you become published, and I think that's absolutely hysterically confusing. If you've ever sat down with a cup of tea and said, "Listen, did you hear what happened on Friday?" You are innately a storyteller. Like, your part of your life is stories, and I think that sometimes we push stories either further away from us because they can be intimidating, or we sometimes forget that our lives are filled with these powerful references and totems of protection, enlightenment, and direction, and we overlook them, thinking that they're not as special as they actually truly are. And once you start sharing them, you realize, or at least I did, is that I was carrying bits of treasure that I thought was scrap, and just leftovers and murmurs, when in fact, like, it's part of an entire people's lineage of understanding that just hadn't been shared. And when it was shared through a settled normative, sometimes a very colonial viewpoint of, these are the small broken people who left the community, rather than you're on one road, we're not behind you, we're on our own road. You know, it's not about the direct comparisons, it's just about our journey and the world around us is just as important to us as your sense of it is to you. And I think that was it's an ongoing wonderful adventure.
One of the things I really love about the book, so it's only just arrived. I haven't read all of it yet, and I had this sort of slight dilemma of going, "Oh, I should read it all before I'm talking to Owen." But actually, that's not the point. I want to enjoy it. I want to savor the stories. So I've only got about a third of the way through. But each story there are two stories in there. So there is a story that you tell about your family and your life, and when and where that story was shared, and then the actual story, which is just a really lovely way of actually kind of sharing that traveller life, and just making it very everyday and very normal. And also, for me, it's really nice to have old stories retold by somebody who is in the young generation, because most of the stories...
Thank you.
But it puts it in a whole different context.
Yeah.
I suppose that the generation of storytellers that I know, and kind of that I suspect most of the people here, there was a generation of Scottish storytellers, Sheila Stewart, Stanley Robertson, Duncan Williamson, who were that last generation in Scotland who were in that kind of very classic stereotyped way of being on the road that people envisage, that they were there in the benders, they were there in the horse-drawn time, and which is seen as like an endless time of when all the stories were set. And they were the last generation who travelled in that way, and they opened out in a hugely generous way to share a lot of stories and culture. But when you have somebody, I mean, like Duncan would be, oh gosh, I think he'd be getting on about 90 now. So when he's saying when he heard these stories, it's putting it in an oldie wordy context. Whereas when you talk about, well, this is when I heard the story, it's not that long ago that you were a kid, so it's within all of our living memory. It's in a time of cars and everything else normal happening. So you were, like you say, on this different road and still in the traveller culture, but still within mainstream culture as we know it, and in a very different time. And that's really fresh and new, certainly for me. And to have young travellers that know the stories and want to tell them. One of my biggest problems is that I've been given these wonderful, wonderful stories that I want to share. And Duncan gave the stories to tell, but I'm not a traveller. And absolutely, there's that thing of I can share the stories, but it's always going to be through a settled point of view. And I mean, it was really nice. His wife said, when I was talking to her about it, she said, "Yes, but Amy, you're just a hen wife, really, aren't you?" some settled people, all right, you've got all your herbs in the garden and people can come and stay with you and that's okay. And that's fine, but it is a different lens. And I can't tell stories as a traveller. It'd be stupid for me to try. And I feel uncomfortable being a voice for travellers as well. So I'm really happy to be a friend and an ally. But I think it's really important for travellers to be talking. I want to be somebody who opens the door, not somebody who's barging in front. But sometimes it's difficult to find travellers, and certainly younger travellers who know the stories, who appreciate them, and who see them as being relevant to their lives, and who want to share them with the wider world. And I think partly that's because a lot of people have been bruised and are frightened about sharing stories, are frightened of being seen as being a traveller, and kind of almost want to cut themselves off because they've experienced prejudice. And sometimes it's like, no, everybody, the outside world has been horrible to me. Why should I share my treasures with them? Which I also totally understand. And so I see you and somebody who is really generous and who is wanting to build a bridge, and you just seem incredibly mature for somebody who's so young. And was there a point when you kind of went, I want to be a voice for my people, actually I want to stand up and shout who I am and be a bridge?
That's actually really interesting, because my sense of, especially within the political spheres we find ourselves in, because everybody's political, we just don't realize we're political. And when it comes to travellers, we're hyper politicized. Like, we can't do anything. Like, the amount of TV shows that are about us, that monitor us, document us. I've counted at least 24 PhDs about the community, everything from religious practice to maternity understanding, anything in between. We're part of genetic studies, like at least 3 national genetic studies to ensure there were minority people. And how I became an activist, or someone who would be in that space, is that I literally just shared opinions. And then suddenly, you're an activist. And I find that fascinating, because I couldn't possibly just be wanting to share understandings. And I like growing up and having the entire world around me, especially people who I would have a certain amount of trust towards, or people in authority, which would have leanings and I suppose understanding that they would know more or be more assured. Their interpretation of my family, my people, my culture, my identity was very derogatory. Especially from people I like for instance, like my favorite teacher in school was a woman called Mrs. Kelly, who's still with us, and she's fabulous. I've spoken to her about this before, so it's not offensive. And when I was in school, we were doing a history project, and eventually bled into English. And she told myself and my classmates, and there was very few travellers in the school at the time in our area, is that travellers had been forced out of their homes during the Cromwellian Wars, and that's where we came from. And the rest of us came from the famine. So it was, and this is someone who I liked, who I adored, who I found, which came in direct conflict with the understandings my family had shared with me. So I went through a very sharp period of, are we failed people that just literally were forced out into an uncomfortable situation? Then realizing that was a very common understanding within the entire nation, is that we weren't our own ethnic group of people who were nomadic. Because I do believe that the innate human aspect of all people is to be nomadic. Like, we are movers. And we are movers, either our resources or kind of space, around endangerment, like fires, food. Like, we're designed to move. And my people are the people who arrived here. All of our stories, it wasn't that we came here. So we were literally, all people were travelers to the island, and that we just continued to move. And knowing stories about where I was from and where my family were connected to the land, the history, to the folk tales, to the historical events that happened, was both incredibly a point of power in my life, but also a very living and currently still ongoing shield against that perception of us. Because either there's the very negative stereotypes, or the wonderfully kind of fantastical kind of romanticization of travelers. With the campfires and the whack in the background, and we're going to go. If you tried that some evening, you're cold, you're wet, like it's like it's a part of people's lives, and people still travel when they can travel, and people who choose not to travel are no less travelers. It's just that sometimes a viable option isn't there. But like, there's a sense of like going, if people to maintain that space takes effort, which means there's a true love of it. And when it comes to my sense of being a traveler, something that Michael McDonagh, who unfortunately, he's a wonderful man, he passed away a week ago, he was a storyteller from in the community. He was adamant, and I really strongly agree with him, is that being a traveller isn't just a title of identity, it's actually a way that we perceive the world around us. Through that lens. And I know that there's hesitation for people in the majority population, are always very nervous of sharing tales of the minority. But if it's done with respect, with reference, with encouragement, when with love, with the beauty of it, it's always acceptable. As long as people make reference of where it came from and try to promote that. And that's something I have genuinely authentically seen through your own work. But I do say that having those anxieties is such a wonderful way to ensure that we don't take advantage. Like, we shouldn't ever be comfortable with sharing the unique tales of certain people, because we end up kind of taking their spaces. That's all people. So I very much welcome that hesitation, but still the preservation to keep saying our table is big enough for more people, and our tales are wide and vast enough for more voices, and our dreams are so enriched when we actually allow ourselves not to dream our own dreams, but to peek into the nighttime understanding of other people.
We're talking a lot about your stories, and obviously I've read some of your book, and I think there's a lot of people here who probably haven't met you before and haven't come across you before. Would you mind giving us a flavour of one of the stories so they've got an idea of what sort of thing we're talking about?
So one of my favourite tales, which is called The Women Who Gather, which is called Ebior Tala Mala Aswert, which is in our language of Gammon. This means the hard work of the rising women. And I'm actually, there's an intro, which I'll save for anyone who wants to dare go wild and purchase the book. But I'll tell you the tale itself, that if you actually spend much time around travellers, you'll often see that many of us wear cords. Usually there's a red and white cord, which is known as the Philomena cord. But if you actually spend time, a lot of us wear certain cords, and these cords are tied with reverence and love by someone who loves us. They can be for protection, they can be for healing, they can be, for all the entire, I suppose, against entire melodies as well as positives. But this is a story of where one of the tales of where one of the cords came from. Once there were old women who would travel the land carrying tightly woven willow baskets to gather the fallen bark or crabapple trees, wilting St. John's wort plants, and fresh beetroot that they could find. They plucked the flax that grew brazenly along the roadside, and wool snared in the thorns of brambles, hawthorn trees, and firs. They dressed mostly in black, with the edges of the garments that were lined in red, white, and yellow. Some of the women had additional stripes on the dresses of different colours, one for each of the children, the living and departed. Their long hair was plaited in tight, firm braids, and about their hips, small beady pockets embellished with metal tokens and buttons that were tied. Every evening they would boil and dye the wool, braid in a big cast iron pot that rested in the campfire in the heart of the molly in which they lived. During the night they would continue to spin and weave the cords or render them red for young children. They would sing songs of hope and melodies of joy in a chorus of sweet voices, with minds of clear intent, stirring and carding, weaving thoughts and prayers into the chorus for the young. At dusk they would gather, at night they would labour, and as the dawn came, they would rest peacefully in their beds. And this is how it was for a very long time. However, as the years wore on, more and more children were born and welcomed to the world, and the old women who gathered began to struggle to keep the pace of their labour. They worked and worked and worked to make the cords of red, the colour of blood, and the tones of deep fire and iron rust. Despite the struggle, they decided they would keep weaving the cord, and one day would weave a cord long enough to encircle the entire world, so no child will be without the care of a loving blessing. Dawn and dusk and night and day blend into one as the work continued, and the old women who gathered forgot to stop to rest and eat. Over time, their fingers, once kissed a soft pink with the dye, became darker and darker, some brown from the dust of the ashes, others black from the coal of the well-stocked fire that kept the dying pot boiling. Still, the old women who gathered worked on. The molly, which was once filled with songs and dances of joy, became silent as they focused more and more on their task. The weavers had worked so hard that sweat from the brows began to wash away from the red from the cord, and it became like a silk grey gossamer. In time, the cords became thinner and delicate as filigree, but as at their core they held and maintained their strength, and still the old women who gathered worked on. They grew thin and bony as they neither slumbered nor feasted, and they began to shrink. Some of the old women who gathered worked one or two of their own fingers away, while others kept their gathering baskets tightly strapped to their backs, not bothering ever to take them off between the gathering, the dyeing, and the weaving of the cords. Their hearts remained warm, and the task remained their true and only focus. In time, the old women who gathered grew smaller and smaller, less of this world and more of another, until one day they looked little more than a bundling of fingers, spinning and weaving with the gathering baskets on their backs, the downward stripes and shadings, who once belonged to the dresses and beady pockets, and they had become the very first spiders. And even now they continue their work, spinning onwards and onwards throughout the very world. And I think that if people would understand what the origins of chords, we still have many of them. We use blue for the sometimes for protection, red and white, which is known as Philomena, for ease of birth. Black in times of people that feel that they've been wounded by a death in the family. And there is a tradition of how the living can hold the dead. And it is a way to remind people to let those who pass before us pass. But I think that it's a wonderful interpretation and sense of connection and sense of understanding that even the spiders around us are part of this entire network of life that's willing us on to feel protected, loved, and encouraged to blossom and disposed to prosper.
Oh, thank you. It's beautiful, and it's really interesting to me as well that you. I won't go on about this much, but that you chose to read it rather than to tell it. And is that hard? Now you've got a book. Is it because you've got a writer hat on, or like you're saying, it's hard because then that's become the one story? Is it hard to let it go and to go back to being oral?
It can be, but also some of the tales that I tell were negotiated, and that sounds very unusual because they came from lists of other people. There was parts of it that people felt that they didn't want to. They were in the wilder spaces, because often like the book can be embraced in spaces like this, but in other spaces it may not be. So people within the family and with the extended community were very cautious, and that was like, and that's something I wanted to break, but I said I would take steps, because so if throughout the book I name people who are dead, and I name people who are living, and I name situations that come with different understandings and interpretations, and like I didn't like negotiate in the sense of, oh, like what terrible things would happen. I did it in so like I want to be respectful as much as possible in the context that most people who've done this in the past have stolen and I suppose profited from our tales. And I didn't want to be the person who, especially internally, just wanted to take that strand. So for the first one, I said, like, I will show people my intentions, and knowing that we are free to share our tales as much as possible. But I would say that I have inherited my father's, my father's, I suppose, gift for storytelling is that no tales are ever anywhere near similar. When we actually came to the audio book, and he would be the originator of many of these tales when I first heard them, he couldn't actually read his own stories. You know, even though he wrote them down, he's like, no, this time there's a giant. Yeah, that's what happened. There's a giant this time. Yeah. So, and that can lead to a lot of chaos when you're trying to. You don't want to formalize something, but you want to find a pattern for people to understand. So, like between the road of chaos and order, there's all that creativity. And,
absolutely, and I get that as well. If you've really agreed a version and they're really happy for that version to go out into the world, then that's it. Yeah, it's sort of honouring their words as well. So, interesting. But it is a really interesting thing. Is once something has been put down, though, how it changes. Now it changes those negotiations.
Mm-hmm. But we negotiate every tale. Like if you find a tale, you tell it to children. You tell it differently to we tell it to a group of middle-aged people, or differently we tell it to older people, or if that tale is being retold beside a mountain or beside the ocean. Like situations allow us to change those tales. But I think when you write something, you don't know the space of where it's being retold. So there's a little bit of a nuance there of this is how we can, because even the language I tried to make as universal as possible when possible. And when I was telling the stories to myself, I didn't want to edit out the natural gammon that would arise in the language, knowing that not everybody's going to understand it. So I'm often in settled normative spaces that I don't understand what people are talking about. And I thought, wouldn't this be wonderful to not actually explain absolutely everything? It's like, for instance, most people wouldn't know what a molly is. That's a traditional camp. Things like chinny is a fire that's stocked only with wood. So there's different things that are throughout the work and the material that aren't explained fully in the glossary, because the idea of either you can find out or it's situated enough that there's enough understanding, but at the same time not wanting to explain everything in full detail because that just takes the mystery.
The that terms of gathering as well that's in that story is something that is throughout the book, but it's also something that is seems to really thread through your life as well, and that seems to be something that's really come from your parents, and something that is very, very alive in the culture. And with my stereotypes, I mean, that's something that I see as being more in the past that people are trying to revive. But the herbalism and the remedies and everything seem to be something that has actually been kept really alive and vibrant. Will you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually within our own, even our health system structures. Here in Ireland, we have the HSE, which is the Health Services Executive, which is similar to the NHS, and it even has policies where travellers are supported, facilitated around traditional healers, herbal remedies, powders, specific metals, blessings, prayers, and charms in whatever way they manifest themselves. And I am of the opinion of that the old world needs to work with the new world, because everything is essentially new in one way or the other. Because how far do we know knowledge can slip back? But also that if something works, it works. And when it comes to herbal remedies, especially that's been tested for generation on generation to certain contexts, people wouldn't be using them if they didn't work. Like there had to be a positive outcome, otherwise it wouldn't be held in any sort of I suppose, repetition. But obviously there's so much to be said around the placebo effect. When it came to herbalism, people had that awareness, and the general population also had an awareness going back a couple of generations that was incredibly vast. And in the last two generations, a lot of people have abandoned it, forgotten it, or simply let it slip away with their elders. Like the idea of someone getting a blister or a boil, to know the very basic remedies around that, around like a yeast complex, like a bread compound. That's very normal, and also for a generation of people. I'm the first generation of people, due to legal policies where nomadism, I'm not sure most people would know, but in England is illegal in the traditional context here in Ireland. So my generation is the first generation who are not allowed to travel. We're allowed to move from halting site to halting site. And that's in the world of halting, which means they want you to stay. So when we weren't doing that, and we had the connection with the open land, you're once outside of your tent or your trailer or caravan, that's your first pharmacy. And to forget the wisdom and understanding and the education that people came before us had about certain plants and remedies and approaches, we're denying their suffering, because we only know that things are poisonous because people suffer to tell us. And we know that things are not as baneful because people try them and will benefit from them. And I think that's another library of understanding that we sometimes don't understand. And I do know that in the 80s and 90s in Ireland, there was a movement where the idea of foraging seemed to be very shameful, that you wouldn't have enough like economic standing, wouldn't have enough income, like why would you forage? And now it's becoming very trendy. And the connection between that trend and that very well placed lifestyle isn't always connected very well with the people, not just travelers, but people from the rural settings or the people lower down on the socioeconomic scales would have held and nurtured and protected and shared so openly. So I do think that those understandings, especially when being used in terms of travelers who spend a lot more time outside, would have been a lot more exposed to the weather and potential ailments from it. That it's an amazing intercultural library of understanding. So there's certain herbs that we would use, that the wider community would use very differently, and there's other herbs that we would be very baneful of. Like one of the plants would have been water hemlock, and our term for it would translate as angel's breath, because the idea would be people who would sleep beneath it. It's so toxic that pollen alone can reduce people to somewhat comatose state and ability to their lung muscles to move. And the idea would be they'd be swept away with the breath of angels. So even that tail alone growing up, like going, yeah, that's angel's breath, this is what it does, stay away from it. While within the traditional term of water hemlock, you don't even get the understanding of like it's dangerous, unless people don't understand obviously the like hemlock itself. But even the term is a bit confused for many people. So I think that allowing references to be grounded and explained through stories is a way not only to seed them literally within our minds so they can grow, but also a way to preserve them within ourselves, to ensure that we can pass them on in ways that aren't just mechanical, but they're actually a part of a living, breathing cultural reference and view of the world that's about promotion as well as protection.
Oh, there's so many questions that are in my head now, and so many.
Ask away.
Well, I'm looking at the time, and I did promise that I would let other people ask questions as well. So, so if other people want to,
I want to hear.
You have one,
because it came direct. Is what is the history behind the family name DeBhairduin? So this is very simple. It is my legal name. My father wanted us to ensure that we had our names within Gammon, which is our language. So DeBhairduin is just a variation of ward or bard, which means poet. D means child of, rather than son or like or daughter, which is Nick or Mac. And bard, which just means poet, and Owen is a version of Tribly, which means family. So I would literally be Owen, the child of the ward family.
That's fantastic. So he made
that comes up all the time. No, it's actually it would be our cultural reference,
right?
Because we had this overhang of people say their name as well or in Irish, say, well, what's the real name? You're kind of going, that is the name, that was the original one until it was changed. So we're still going through that process. So when travelers are using our names within a cultural context, because we have different, like we didn't always have a version for Mary is Sagro. So we had our own versions of the names, just like in different languages. So we ourselves are going through the process of reclaiming our language to know that it's just as valuable as the primary English that has been like fostered and given to us. Because even within the Irish context, Irish is the first language. And as of 2018, Gammon is recognised under the UNESCO protections as being an Irish language. Although at the moment it just hasn't received any resources, funding, like actual education in the curriculum. That will happen, and it's about time that we move beyond this idea of it's not a secret. That's my favorite thing. One of my favorite myths people tell. It's a secret language. I have 11 dictionaries. It's not secret. It's just it's a internalized used language that people like to use internally, and it has a history behind it. It was used for protection. It was used for different ways, but like when we were home, we were still using it. And I do think sometimes the general population has difficulty the idea of, because their understanding of travelers is so reinforced with a counterculture that's deliberate, is that almost our language, it's from our own people, was about settled people, that we only used it around settled people, that we all went home and spoke English only. And I just find that bizarre, because we never say it's secret to each other. We only say that to buffers, which is settled people. We say it's a secret language, when it's far from. I mean, one of the first dictionaries is like Leland, and you have 1800s, and at that stage, when he was researching this, Charles J. Leland, who eventually became the chair of the Gypsy Lower Society, questionable man or some things, which wasn't the best. But he was a decent enough researcher, but somehow was very confused when he spoke to people from Wales, Scotland, mainland England, and Wales that had a connection with Irish travellers. They're all saying the same or near the same words for references, but still some concluded two things. The one that it was an ancient Celtic language, which nothing is ever preserved stagnantly in time, so that doesn't really make sense to me. Like, things are allowed to grow, it's natural, and we don't want to romanticize it. But also that it was such an integral part of our community's reference to ourselves, our language, that it couldn't just simply be about hiding our intentions with settled people.
So the signal was just a little bit dodgy at the beginning. So I just want to check that I understood it right. So your family name means child in the family of the bard. Is that right? Yeah.
Or the child of the bard family.
Child of the bard family.
There's little anomalies in our language. Like in Asquelga, there's no W. So we have BH, and there's no W within the Asquelga alphabet. But most of our language was recorded by settled people applying an English structure to it. So when we do have W's, it's the leftover from the settled people recording it rather than ourselves.
Right. I think I understand that. Yeah. So if anybody else has got any questions that they want to ask, now is your time to quickly get them in on the Q&A. We are going to be wrapping up fairly soon, but there's so many different directions that we can go in this last little bit of time that we've got, Owen. And I suppose what I really want is, what is the one thing or a couple of key things that you would like people to go away knowing about Irish travellers and maybe just giving us what would you like us to be thinking about, if there's a question that you want us to be thinking about as we head off as well.
Well, I think it's very pertinent at the moment in the Irish context, but I think also internationally, that we should be promoting the education of the culture and history of travellers and all minorities and ethnic groups within our formal curricula. Otherwise, there will always be a disadvantage of how we connect to each other. Secondly, like, this is what I find the most amazing thing, is that we are just as boring as everybody else. We're not just fantastic people. And I think it's really important to hold on to that, because people are going to, going like, we're just as, trust me, my Friday evenings, wild as a cup of tea. And the third is about taking on niche us on the common ground of friendship. Don't be afraid to reach out to people, to develop authentic relationships, to get to know your neighbors. Because sometimes I think that people know the history and then go, am I overstepping my boundaries? Am I being enforced? But I'm kind of going, people are people. You will know when people don't want you to be around, and you will know when people want to spend time. And to take every opportunity that we can to foster those friendships and relationships, because that's how we truly get to know each other. There's no book, there's no class, there's no seminar, and there's no workshop that can actually teach you our actual culture. Because when people think culture, they actually think problems. They think accommodation issues, think mental health issues, think employment, or think a retrospective only understanding of who we are, rather than contemporary peers living and coexisting in a society that may understand us less than they may understand you, depending on your own intersectionality, but just as valuable to the world and the needs of the world as everybody else. And so if any opportunities arise to get involved with local groups, local understanding, settings, organization, network, go meet people. I mean, treat us as people. We're just people. Some of us are like, seriously, I always find myself incredibly boring. But there's also, I'm sure that loads of people in your own world, you kind of go like, oh, would anyone be interested? You kind of go, yeah, loads of people would. And take the opportunity to forge that bridge. But bridges aren't in the real world around relationships. They're not just stagnant rocks upon the clay. They're ever evolving, stretching, rebuilding, repainting, redesigning relationships as we learn to understand each other as others and as we are together. So I would say promotion of education, demystifying and de-romanticizing people, and just seeing them as people, and then taking the initiative to foster that kindred fire of a shared experience as much and as many and as often as you can.
And I think this is the exciting thing about this time. And I mean, hopefully in some ways we're going into a bit of a golden age. I know that there are many, many problems with the world, but coming out of the pandemic, I think there is this kind of international network that's been established online. So yes, it's going to be absolutely fantastic to spend more time in person with people. But it's kind of, I'm trying really hard to avoid phrases like real people and real places, because for me, this has been an absolutely amazing gateway to get to know people that I would never bump into walking down the street. And actually, I can't go to events at my local town hall that, kind of for Irish Traveller Pride Week or whatever. So, but those events and those spaces are here where we can come together, and there are places where we can ask questions and we can meet and decide if we like each other or not, if we want to spend more time, and where those commonalities are. So do let me know about any events that you were organising, and chances for people to hear you, and let's keep the doorways open and the bridges uncluttered. Obviously, I'll be sharing things that I see, and the only other question that has really come up is where to get your book, which is a very important question. And I'm going to stick on the chat right now. And I'm assuming excellent. Direct from Skane Press is the place to go. Yes.
I wouldn't be a huge promoter of either Skane Press itself or your local bookstore, but if it is all possible, avoid links unless necessary as Amazon. I think we need to nurture our space as much as possible rather than the conglomerate kind of processes.
Yeah.
Always political. Can't stop it.
Well, but that's the thing. It's direct from the publisher, as you said. You were able to meet them in person, and it's that human touch. It's about relationships, and that is really, You don't have a relationship with Amazon, do you? You know, it's kind
no. Nor would I want to foster one. But I think as well that people don't realize the intricacies of publishing. It was a new word for myself. Anyone here who's an established or aspiring kind of, I suppose, co-creator of a book, I found it difficult with the publishers, the idea of even pondering and finding someone who hadn't published anti-traveller rhetoric or material. And that was very important to me, that I wasn't putting any potential grades or finances or money into the pockets of people who had done damage. And that was a very simple process, and obviously someone was located, but even that question alone was uncomfortable for some of the publishers.
I can well understand that. And I think, you know, and I think any publisher over a certain age is going to struggle with that.
And then do they embrace it? They go, yeah, we did do that. We've learned from that. And you go, that's fine. I mean, like, everyone is allowed to have a history because things happen within context. But once we know better, there's an onus on us to do better. And people who are resistant to that, I would just be very wary of on a personal level of, like, going, if you haven't made a mistake, you haven't lived. But if you deny that mistake, you're not allowing other people to.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good thought to leave us with, actually. And again, that's been a story of the last sort of couple of years, and certainly for me, and my mistake is kind of, I'm constantly every day being exposed to how many things I don't know and how much ignorance I've had. And I was blessed with a very sheltered upbringing, and for me, it's absolutely been finding out about those questions and actually, these are things that I need to know about, and these are things that I need to question. And what can we do? What can we do just to reach out and to help everybody be a little bit more empathic and interested? And then the world just becomes a much more interesting place for everybody. So this is the end of the conversation, but you can continue your own private conversation with Owen if you'd like to get the book and read the stories, which I do highly recommend. And also, I'm just trying to find some of the lovely illustrations, because it's also illustrated by Leanne McDuff. Is it McDuff?
No.
I've said that wrong.
McDonagh.
I'm sorry.
Who is also who's a traveller who happens to also be an artist. And in fact, we searched, and it came out last year. So it was the first book of traveller folktales that was actually written by a traveller, and then following on to be illustrated by a traveller. And to break that threshold in 2020 is what a wonderful thing, but also a sorrowful reflection of where we are. But also it just shows you the potential of where we could be.
And yeah, it's about making decisions for a reason rather than just always going for what's easy without even thinking about it, isn't it? So
yeah. And actually, on the website, there should be a page, should be a page on the website of some of her work, as well as the audio over snippets. See if we can put up the link afterwards. But it would be on the Scheme Press website.
Please do send me the link for that, and I'll put the links up on YouTube to where you can buy the book, and to any links that Owen sends me, and where you can find out more about Owen. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you all very much for being part of this evening. Now, the bit that I hate saying and usually fail dismally to say is that so Owen has agreed to come and do this for absolutely nothing. Apart from just my heartfelt thanks and gratitude. I do take in the tradition on because I love it, but I do now have a Patreon site. So if you want to know who's going to be the next month's guest, that's where you'll always find it out. And it is a place that gives me a closed place where I can try things out. So quite often you might hear me working on new stories, you might get free tickets to gigs that I'm doing, and it's there are many things that I feel uncomfortable about being paid for, but it does give me a little bit of opportunity to spend time setting these things up and doing podcasts that otherwise I'm thinking, oh God, I've got to pay the rent this, I've got to pay the mortgage this month. So if you would like to be one of my patrons, then you can find me, Amy Douglas, and Taking the Tradition on Patreon. Have you got a Patreon site, Owen?
No. I
Just
have
buy the book.
I have 2 jobs, you know, and I love for sharing tales. So I think I'm usually busy enough. But I do think we need to, when possible, to invest in people who are able to have the opportunity to cultivate those storytelling spaces, because stories are connecting to our past and they are signals for our future. So I mean, delighted that you have a patron, and long may it prosper.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions. And of course, most of all, thank you so much to Oein DeBhairduin for coming and sharing your stories, your heritage, your herbalism, and for coming back, making a real effort to get back into the room. So good night. Taking the Tradition on will be back on the first Tuesday of next month, which is Tuesday the 2nd of November. Wherever you are in the world, in America, in Britain, in Ireland, in Europe, we all share the same planet. We all share the same skies. Go and take a moment to go outside. See if you can see a spider web and take a moment to remember. Good night.